Ever wonder why your metal kick drum lacks clarity in your mix? After 20 plus years of producing, I found a formula that gets you that heavy, punchy kick sound that cuts through a wall of dense, heavy guitars. So I'm going to show you how to dial in the perfect metal kick sound to make sure your kicks are clear and balanced. So I think there's a bit of a misconception around EQing a metal kick drum. You hear a lot of people saying if you want that clicky metal bass drum sound to boost 8 to 10k. And before we go any further, I'm not saying that's necessarily wrong, but I think there's some confusion that happens when people talking about where they're boosting and what's actually cutting through in the mix. As someone that's worked with tons of different live sound engineers over the years, I always go out and have a look at what they're doing in sound checks, and it's really common to see people doing a huge high shelf on kick drums, boosting 8 to 10k, sometimes up to 15 dB. And a lot of them would just say, this is just what I got shown in college when I was learning about dialing in kick drum sounds, especially for metal. But this is where some of the misconception comes in, and I'm going to show you visually what I'm on about in a sec. So some of the more commonly known kick drum mics, like a D12, has barely any high end above 5k on it. So you can be boosting 10k for up to 15 dB. And just by doing that doesn't mean that 10k or 8k is going to be the most prominent or loudest part of your kick sound. And basically, because every kick drum sounds different, every microphone sounds different, unless you have the same kick, the same microphone and mic placement, you cannot just copy someone else's EQ settings or just a kick drum preset from a plugin and expect to get the same sound. It's really important to factor in what your source material is and how it's been treated, if at all, before you start trying to process your kick drum. If you're using program drums, there are a lot of drum sample libraries that are partially processed already, even though they sound kind of raw. And there are some drum sample libraries that are fully mixed sounding out of the box. Alternatively, you might be working with real drums, and raw kick drums are really hard to work with in metal. Or you might be working with TCI files or drum samples that might be pre-processed. So I'm going to show you the difference between using a raw kick drum sound and a pre-processed sample and still trying to get the exact same type of result. Okay, so I've got a raw unprocessed kick drum sound here from our new record. This is Yamaha kick drum with a D112 microphone in it. This is how it sounds with no EQ, no processing. So if we apply a high shelf here, as we can see on the frequency analyzer, the highest point in the high mids and high end is still coming in around here, around 2.5k. Even if we do a bell boost around 10k, that's more like 8, either way. It's still not the loudest part of the signal. And even though it's much louder, it's still not going to be the most prominent part to cut through the mix. So hearing people talking about boosting 10k for a clicky metal bass drum may be a move that you might make on a raw, unprocessed sound like this one. But it does not mean that you want the peak of your high end coming through at 10k. And I'll show you an example of that within a mix context in a minute. So let me EQ this bass drum to get it in a place where I think it will sit in the mix. I think the best thing for kick drums is to sit around that 2 to 5k area and occupy that and really lock in with the high end on the guitars, and it makes for a really pleasing sort of machine-like mechanical locked in sound when the guitars and the kick drums kind of marry in that same area. So there's quite a bit of this 2k, which actually might be a little bit too much. And then we can carve out some of the mids here. And then I'll do like a high pass filter just to get rid of any of that subby stuff we don't really need, especially for fast metal. So as you can see, there's quite a high boost here. I'm boosting around 7.5k, doing a high shelf, carving out some of the mids, getting rid of some of the subby information that we don't really need. And that's typically how I'll EQ a metal kick drum in the mix, and it'll have that sort of typical EQ curve for me. So let me show you the sounds of these kick drums in a mix context. Okay, so I've got a metal mix going with some fast double pedal in it. I've got ultimate heavy drums going here, but I've muted the kicks on this. So I've got the kicks on two separate tracks, which again is just two other instances of ultimate heavy drums. So I'm going to have, this one's just the regular kicks as they are in UHD. And I've got an EQ on here. And as I cycle through the kicks, they all have different sounds, but the EQ curve is relatively similar. So let me flick through some different kick sounds and you can sort of see what might be changing on the EQ curve. Although some of these kicks will have varying degrees of high end above 10K, they all drop off in this area to some degree. It's still not the loudest part in the mix. Now, I really recommend using pre-mixed drum libraries or pre-mixed guitar tones because I think it's really useful to be able to reverse engineer what you're hearing. I spent a lot of my time sampling albums, sampling guitar tones, sampling kick drums, snare drums from records, and looking at those EQ curves. The problem with sampling from a record is you'll hear room mic or reverb on the drums that might cloud your judgment of what's actually being applied to the closed shells or the samples. And with guitar tones, I like to know what the source tone is versus how it might have been EQ'd in the mix. But when I was younger and learning about music production, I would have loved to have been able to get my hands on pre-mixed sounds that sound just like the records that I liked, and then A/B my source sounds to see how close I could get them. Okay, so on this bottom channel, I'm using the default kick drum here, and I've got an EQ applied to this. This is just the close mic kick we're using from this, and I'm trying to make 10K the loudest part of the high end. So let's look at it. So you can see the high end is peaking in this area, which is unnatural for at least any of the kicks I mix. So we can A/B the sound of that 10K prominent kick drum versus how I would typically mix a kick drum to cut through more in the upper mids between 2 to 5K and having that the most prominent area of the kick's high end. This can be kind of personal preference, and maybe you do hear kick drums with a ton of 10K in them. Now, I hear a lot of kicks with a lot of 10K in them, but they still have a good amount of that 2 to 5K like upper mid-range kind of knock to them. But it's very rare that you hear kick drums with more 10K or 8K than anything else in the high end. And it actually starts to lack clarity. It doesn't cut through quite as well. The high end turns into sort of like a papery kind of sound that kind of blends in with the cymbals. And when you have a more 2 to 5K upper mid-range high end to your kick drums, it kind of cuts through in a lot more of a noticeable way. So this is the sound of the default kick with no EQ. And this is 10K focused high end that looks like this. Now, I'm not saying you could never have a kick that sounds like this. I personally don't think it sounds good. I don't think it cuts through in the same way that it should. All of this stuff is personal preference. There might be people out there that prefer it sounding like this. I think the kick definition gets lost when you have less of that kind of knock focus, the upper mid-range kind of cut to your kick sound. So I can go and A/B between those two kicks and you can hear the difference. Now, if you did want a bit more high end, you could add some in, but I just wouldn't recommend that being the highest peak of your high end on the kick. But within Ultimate Heavy Drums, you can use the tilt EQ to make things a bit brighter if you want. So you can still mix the sound of the drums without having to route any of this through your DAW. When it comes to dialing in a great metal kick sound, it really helps having something like Pro Q3 or Pro Q4 with a really great frequency analyzer so you can look at what you're doing. I know a lot of people will say you're a hack if you just rely on your eyes when it comes to mixing, but this is the easiest way to dial in a kick sound that you know is going to work in a mix. So I'm going to cycle through different kick drums in Ultimate Heavy Drums. But what you'll notice is when you look at them, they're going to visually have quite a similar kind of EQ curve to them. So even if you have different beaters, different skins, different dimension drums, If you try and get the same EQ curve, it doesn't mean they're going to sound the same. There's just some principles that I like to stick to that always work in my mixes. So the main one is the focus of my low end, i.e. the loudest part of my low end, is usually around 70 hertz, between 70 and 80. The highest part of my kick high end or upper mids is usually around 4K, anywhere from 3 to 6K. And there'll be varying degrees of high end above 6K. Sometimes there'll be a steep cutoff, sometimes there'll be a bit more top end, but the loudest part is always going to be around 4K. And then usually we're doing quite a cut around 200. So let me cycle through the kicks and you can see what they look like. So you definitely will see some differences there. I wanted to create a very versatile drum library. So I wanted to make sure different types of mixing aesthetics were covered. So more kind of rock sounding kick drums, more really clicky, fast sounding kick drums, more modern, ultra dense, ultra thumpy kick drums, but they all share similar characteristics. So if I go back to the default kick drum here, this one, second one down, this one is a pretty good demonstration of like a typical decent sounding metal kick drum. So the loudest part of the low end is coming through here around 70 hertz. So you'll see we don't have too much below that here in the low end. You don't want too much sub information, especially with really fast, heavy music. Too much subs on your kicks can really eat up a lot of room when you start to master and limit and compress your mix. Then typically anywhere from 200 to 300 is usually like the quietest area, aside from, you know, the low sub and the ultra high end. You can hear when I boost that area, it's quite unpleasant and it just adds a kind of boxiness that you don't want in your mix. And then quite a big cut here around 500, 600. Now, when you're doing typical rock music, adding in quite a wide boost at 1K can sound really good, and sometimes I might try adding in a bit more mids to my metal kicks just to see if they cut through. But for the most part, you can have quite a scoop sound as long as your high end is focused in this area. Then it's going to cut through. So this kick actually is a little bit more focused around 5K. But it drops off above that and it drops off below that. But there's still quite a decent amount happening between 2 to 5K. That's really going to cut through your mix, going to cut through the guitars, but also kind of gel with the high end on your guitars as well. So hopefully now you know how to dial in an incredible sounding metal kick drum. But if you want to know some moves to add even more punch to your drum mix, then check this video out next.